Have you ever heard a silence so profound it screams? That's the first thing you notice about Black Hope Cemetery, a forgotten patch of earth in the desolate heart of Texas, where the dead are buried. But their stories are not. They say, if you listen closely, right as the sun bleeds out of the sky, you can hear the whispers of those who were laid to rest in anger, their final secrets clawing their way out of the compacted soil. This isn't just a place of rest. It's a place of waiting, and what it waits for is company. My name is Alex, and for 3 years, my podcast, Grave Doubts, has been my shield against the dark. I travel to the most allegedly haunted locations in the country, armed with EMF meters, audio recorders, and a healthy dose of skepticism, always aiming to debunk the myths. Black Hope was supposed to be just another episode, another collection of local superstitions and creaking gates. The legend here centered on a figure they called the Shadow Caretaker, a spectral groundskeeper named Silas, who, after his own tragic death within these gates, was said to tend the graves with a jealous fury, dragging disrespectful visitors into the earth with him. The town of Black Hope itself felt like a tombstone for a bygone era. Boarded up storefronts stared out like hollow eye sockets onto a single dusty road. The locals, a handful of weathered souls, spoke of the cemetery in hushed, fearful tones. They warned me not to go there after dark, not to touch the graves, and especially not to speak the name of Silas aloud on consecrated ground. Their fear was palpable, a living thing in the oppressive Texas heat. But to me, it was merely color for my narrative, the perfect atmospheric setup for my listeners. Arriving at the cemetery was like stepping into a photograph from another century. Rusted iron gates, twisted into the shapes of weeping angels, hung ajar. The path was choked with weeds, and the headstones, many of them worn smooth by time and sorrow, leaned on each other like tired old men. There was a profound sense of isolation here. The wind was the only voice, and it whispered through the dry grass with a mournful sigh. I began setting up my equipment near an ancient, gnarled oak tree that dominated the center of the graveyard, its branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The legend of Silas was simple yet chilling. He was the cemetery's caretaker in the late 1800s, a man utterly devoted to his silent wards. During a severe cholera outbreak, the town ran out of space, and a decision was made to exhume older, forgotten graves to make room for the newly dead. Silas, seeing this as the ultimate desecration, stood against the townsfolk. The story goes they killed him for his defiance, burying him in an unmarked grave among the very souls he protected. Now his shadow is said to rise with the moon, shovel in hand, forever guarding his domain. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and blood orange, the atmosphere grew heavy. The air, once hot and dry, became unnaturally cold around the old oak tree. My first piece of equipment A sensitive EMF meter began to spike erratically. I chalked it up to old wiring from a nearby, long-abandoned service road. Skepticism is a habit, after all, and I wasn't ready to let go of it. I started my audio recording, introducing the episode with a confident, slightly mocking tone as I recounted the local folklore. The first truly unexplainable event was subtle. I had placed a series of motion-activated cameras along the main path. One of them triggered, sending a notification to my tablet. The image it captured was empty, just a blurry shot of leaning tombstones. But in the corner of the frame, a long, thin shadow stretched from the base of a grave, a shadow that had no source. The sun had completely set, and my own flashlight was pointed in the opposite direction. I felt a prickle of unease, the first crack in my cynical armor. I decided to do a walkthrough, narrating my experience for the podcast. As I moved deeper into the cemetery, the feeling of being watched intensified. It was a classic haunting trope, easily explained by paranoia and the suggestive environment. But then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic scraping sound. It was distant at first, like a branch dragging across stone. I stopped, holding my breath, and the sound stopped with me. I told my listeners it was likely an animal, a nocturnal scavenger perhaps, but the silence that followed felt deliberate, intelligent. My path took me to the oldest section of the cemetery, where the graves were little more than crumbling stone nubs in the earth. Here the air was thick with the scent of freshly turned soil, a smell that had no business being there. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness and landed on a small, unmarked headstone, one I hadn't noticed on my initial survey. In front of it, the ground was disturbed, as if someone had been digging just moments ago. The scraping sound returned, much closer this time, just beyond my line of sight. A chill, not born of the night air, snaked down my spine. I called out, a foolish act of bravado for my audience. "Hello, is someone there?" The only reply was the wind, but it seemed to carry a whisper, a sibilant hiss that coiled around my ears. It was indistinct, like the ghost of a word. I took a step back, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was no longer about creating a spooky podcast. This was about a growing, primal fear that told me I had trespassed somewhere I was not welcome. I retreated to my base camp near the oak tree, my composure frayed. I checked my audio recorder, hoping it had picked up the whisper. As I rewound the track, I heard my own voice, then the wind, and then, clear as day, a single guttural word breathed directly into the microphone. Mine. It was a voice that sounded like grinding stones and dry leaves, ancient and possessive. My blood ran cold. The microphone had been clipped to my collar. Whatever spoke had been standing right beside me. Panic began to set in. This was no longer a game or a show. I looked out into the graveyard, which now seemed like a labyrinth of shadows. Every tombstone looked like a hunched figure. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. I noticed that the motion-activated camera that had triggered earlier was now facing the wrong way. It had been physically turned to point directly at me. I hadn't been near it since setting it up. I was not alone here, and whatever was with me was aware of my every move. Suddenly, all my equipment died at once. The EMF meter went silent, the camera feeds cut out, and my flashlight flickered and went dark, plunging me into near-total blackness, with only the pale moonlight offering any illumination. It was a coordinated, deliberate failure, a technological sea. A profound, absolute silence fell over the cemetery once more. But this was different. It was the heavy, expectant silence of a predator that knows its prey is trapped. I was the prey, using the dim light from my phone's screen. I fumbled in my bag for my backup flashlight. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip it. As the powerful beam sliced through the darkness, it immediately fell upon a figure standing not 30 feet away. It wasn't a man. It was a silhouette, impossibly tall and thin, like a line of ink drawn against the night. It held a long object that I knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, was an old, rusted shovel. The shadow caretaker was no longer a legend. It didn't move in any conventional sense. There were no steps, no rustling of leaves. I blinked, and it was closer, now standing by a large granite angel, its form seeming to melt into and out of the statue's shadow. It had no discernible features, just a void-like darkness in the shape of a man, a distortion in the fabric of reality. The scraping sound began again, slow and methodical, as the figure dragged the tip of its shovel along the stone path, a sound that echoed the scraping of a coffin lid against stone. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I scrambled through the rows of tombstones, stumbling over roots and sunken graves, my breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel its presence behind me, a cold, oppressive weight that seemed to suck all the warmth from the air. The rhythmic scraping of the shovel continued, sometimes seeming to come from my left, sometimes from my right, a disorienting, terrifying pursuit. It was toying with me. My goal was the rusted gate, the threshold between this nightmare world and the sanity of the road beyond. It seemed impossibly far. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw nothing. For a brief, insane moment, I thought I had imagined it. Then a shadow fell over me from the side. I turned, and it was there, standing atop a large mausoleum, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It wasn't chasing me. It was simply appearing wherever I was going to be. There was no escape. In my panic, I changed direction, veering towards a dilapidated chapel that stood at the edge of the grounds. The door hung open on one hinge, a gaping maw that promised some semblance of shelter. I threw myself inside, slamming the heavy wooden door shut and fumbling with the rusted iron bolt, managing to slide it into place. The small building was filled with the smell of decay and damp earth. Dust motes danced in the single beam of moonlight that pierced through a hole in the roof. For a moment, there was silence. I leaned against the door, my body trembling, trying to catch my breath. I thought I might be safe. Then came the sound. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was just outside the door, slow, deliberate, and patient. It wasn't the sound of someone trying to get in. It was the sound of someone digging. A horrifying realization dawned on me. It wasn't trying to break the door down. It was sealing me in, burying me alive within the crumbling walls of the chapel. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I stood frozen in the center of the chapel, my flashlight beam dancing nervously around the decaying pews and the collapsed altar. A new sound started, a faint scratching coming from the stone floor directly in front of me. I lowered the beam of light and watched in absolute horror as a single dark word was etched into the grimy flagstones, carved by an unseen force. Disrespect. It was an accusation and a sentence. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble. The floorboards groaned, and the stone altar cracked. From the very center of the chapel, the flagstones began to shift and separate, revealing a gaping blackness below, an open grave that had not been there seconds before. A cold, foul-smelling air rose from the opening, carrying with it the scent of ancient death and rot. This chapel wasn't a sanctuary, it was a tomb, and it had been prepared for me. The shadow was not just a guardian, it was an undertaker. A form began to rise from the newly opened grave. It was not the tall, thin shadow from outside, but something else, something far worse. It was a writhing mass of shapes and whispers, the coalesced despair of all the disturbed souls Silas guarded. Faces contorted in silent screams flashed within the churning darkness, their ethereal hands reaching for me. This was the source of the caretaker's power, the collective rage of the forgotten dead he had sworn to protect. He wasn't just haunting the cemetery, he was commanding it. From the doorway, a deep, resonant voice echoed, the same voice I had heard on my recorder. But now it filled the entire chapel, shaking the very stones. You woke them, it boomed, a voice of pure, undiluted fury. You spoke my name. You gave them a focus for their pain. The tall shadow of Silas now stood in the chapel's entrance, the bolted door no obstacle for him. His form was clearer now, a solid blackness that seemed to drink the moonlight. And in the place where a face should be, there were only two faintly glowing, malevolent embers. The shadowy mass from the grave surged towards me. I was paralyzed by terror, my feet rooted to the spot. I could feel the icy touch of spectral fingers brushing against my skin. Hear the cacophony of their silent screams echoing directly inside my mind. I raised my heavy-duty flashlight, the most powerful one I owned, and on pure instinct, I flicked it to its highest setting, aiming the blinding strobe function directly at the shadowy figure of Silas. It was a desperate, foolish hope against a supernatural force. A terrible, unearthly shriek ripped through the air, a sound of static and tearing fabric. The shadow recoiled from the intense, pulsing light, its form wavering and distorting, as if in agony. The mass of spirits faltered, their advance slowing as their anchor, their master, was assaulted. The light wasn't hurting it physically, but it seemed to disrupt its connection to this plane, a shockwave of pure energy against its spectral form. It gave me a precious second, a window of opportunity. I didn't run for the door where Silas was reeling. I ran for the wall with adrenaline-fueled strength. I slammed my shoulder against the decaying wooden planks at the back of the chapel. The rotted wood splintered and gave way, and I tumbled out into the night, landing hard on the damp earth. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the searing pain in my shoulder, and sprinted away from the chapel of horrors, not daring to look back. The unholy shriek of the shadow caretaker chasing me through the rows of tombstones. I didn't stop running until I burst through the rusted gates and onto the dirt road, collapsing onto the ground, my lungs burning. The first hint of dawn was just beginning to touch the horizon, a faint gray line that promised salvation. The sounds from the cemetery had ceased as the soft morning light began to spill over the land. The oppressive atmosphere of Black Hope Cemetery seemed to recede, the deep shadows reluctantly retreating among the graves. I had survived the night. I managed to get back to my car, shaking uncontrollably. Most of my equipment was left behind, sacrificed to the darkness. But my personal audio recorder was still in my pocket. I drove away from Black Hope without a second glance, the rising sun in my rearview mirror feeling like a guardian angel. I drove for hours, not stopping until I was in a crowded, brightly lit diner in another county, surrounded by the normal, comforting sounds of life. But I knew I would never feel truly normal again. Back in my hotel room, I finally dared to listen to the last recording. It was mostly my own panicked breathing and the sound of my frantic escape. But right at the end, after the sound of me crashing through the chapel wall, there was a moment of perfect, chilling clarity. The voice of Silas, no longer booming with rage, but low and filled with a cold, terrifying promise, spoke 7 words: "You cannot bury what will not die." Then the recording ended in a burst of static. I never produced the Black Hope Cemetery episode. I shut down my podcast, packed up my gear, and tried to disappear back into a normal life. I told myself it was a hallucination, a waking nightmare brought on by the power of suggestion and isolation. But I couldn't explain the deep, jagged scratches that covered the back of the heavy wooden chapel door, scratches made from the inside. I couldn't explain the single, impossible frame of video I recovered from a corrupted file, showing a shadow that stood 12 feet tall. Weeks turned into months. I moved to a new city, hoping to put hundreds of miles between me and that cursed place in Texas. The nightmares, at first relentless, began to fade. I started to believe I was free, that the horror had been left behind, buried in the desecrated soil of Black Hope. I was wrong. It started subtly, a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow in a doorway that seemed just a little too tall, a little too thin. Now I see him more oft. In the reflection of a dark window, I see a tall figure standing behind me, shovel in hand. When I turn, there's nothing there. I've started hearing things again. A faint scraping sound from the empty apartment next door in the dead of night. I know it's Sela's. I don't know how or why, but when I ran from that cemetery, a piece of its darkness clung to me. I took something from that place, and now its guardian has come to claim it back. I am no longer a skeptic. I am a haunted man. Black Hope Cemetery is not just a place on a map. It's a patient, waiting entity. Sela's is not bound by its rusted gates. He is a promise, an eternal caretaker, not just for his forgotten graves, but for anyone who disrespects the slumber of the dead. He showed me that some legends are true, that some shadows have substance, and that there are places in this world where the silence is a warning. So if you ever find yourself on a lonely Texas road and see a sign for Black Hope, I implore you to keep driving. Do not stop. Do not get curious, because some stories aren't meant to be told, and some graves are best left undisturbed. Sela's is still out there, tending to his flock, and he is always looking for new souls to add to his collection. Buried but never, ever forgotten, and he knows my name now. He whispers it in the dark, a constant, chilling reminder that my own final resting place has already been dug.